Before Singapore became one of the richest and cleanest countries in the world, it was just a small island, poor, crowded, and uncertain about its future. There were no natural resources, no oil, no gold, not even enough clean water. Many people lived in old houses, without proper roads or jobs. At that time, the world did not believe Singapore could survive on its own. But one man did. He was Kuan, a young lawyer with a sharp mind and a strong will. He believed that even a small country could become great if its people were honest, disciplined, and well-educated. He worked day and night to change people's thinking. He fought against corruption. He built schools, factories, and homes. He created laws that made every citizen equal, regardless of race or language. And slowly, the impossible began to happen. Within one generation, Singapore changed from a struggling island into a model of success for the whole world. This is not just the story of a leader. It is the story of vision, courage, and belief. How one man built a nation from nothing and showed the world that greatness is not about size, but about strength of mind and heart. This is the story of Kuan, the man who transformed a small, struggling island into one of the strongest, smartest, and most admired nations on earth. Kuan was born on September 16, 1923, in Singapore, which was then part of the British Empire. At that time, Singapore was not the modern city we know today. It was a small trading port, crowded with ships, workers, and British officers who ruled over the land. His family was part of the English-educated Straits Chinese community, Chinese families who had lived for generations in the British colonies of Malaya and Singapore. They spoke both English and Malay at home and followed Chinese traditions. The family was middle class but not wealthy. Lee's father, Lee Chin Kuan, worked as a storekeeper for a shipping company. He was educated, disciplined, and wanted a stable life for his children. His mother, Chua Jim Neo, was a strong and practical woman who managed the household with care. From her, young Lee learned the importance of hard work, thrift, and self-respect. As a child, Lee was clever, curious, and full of energy. He loved reading, observing people, and asking questions about how things worked. He studied first at Telok Kurau Primary School, then at Raffles Institution, one of the best schools in Singapore. His teachers quickly saw his sharp memory and leadership qualities. But his childhood was not easy. In the 1930s, the world was changing fast. The Great Depression had affected trade, and life in Singapore was uncertain. Still, Lee studied hard. He won top grades in English and mathematics, and developed a deep respect for discipline and order. Values that would later shape his entire nation. Even as a teenager, Lee was known for being bold, confident, and outspoken. He did not blindly follow others. He questioned unfair rules and always looked for practical solutions. His classmates remembered him as someone who spoke with authority even at a young age. In 1940, after finishing school, Lee earned a scholarship to study at Raffles College, a rare opportunity for any Asian student under British rule. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, to fight for justice and equality. But before his dreams could take flight, the world around him would soon collapse, as war reached the shores of Singapore. In 1940, Kuan began his studies at Raffles College, a rare opportunity for any Asian student under British rule. He studied English, economics, mathematics, history, and political science, preparing himself for a future in law. He believed that with knowledge and justice, society could be changed. But his education was soon interrupted by forces far beyond Singapore's shores. In December 1941, the world of Southeast Asia was shaken. Bombs fell, sirens echoed. The Japanese army moved forward with terrifying speed. Within weeks, lectures stopped and classrooms emptied. Raffles College was forced to close. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell to Japan. The city that once felt safe under British power was now under occupation. It was the darkest chapter in the island's history. Kuan watched this collapse with his own eyes. He had seen the British as strong, permanent, unshakable. But now they had surrendered. This realization struck deep. If the British can fall, we must learn to stand on our own. The Japanese renamed Singapore Sionanto, meaning Light of the South. Life under Japanese rule was marked by fear and silence. Food became scarce. Movement was controlled. Speaking carelessly could cost a life. Thousands of innocent civilians, especially Chinese men, were taken away during the Sukching massacre and never returned. Lee narrowly escaped death. Once, he was lined up with other young men for screening. By quick thinking, he convinced the soldiers he worked for a Japanese company. That decision saved his life. During the occupation, Lee could no longer attend college, but he did not stop learning. He studied on his own. He observed how power controlled society. He saw how people suffered. He saw how society collapsed. And he learned how people survive when they have no choice. He made himself a promise. If Singapore ever becomes free again, we must build a government that is strong, fair, and disciplined. Never weak, never corrupt. In August 1945, everything changed. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and another on Nagasaki. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China. The war was over, the Allies had won, and the Japanese occupation of Singapore ended. British troops returned to take control once more. Singapore was free from Japan, but broken, hungry, and uncertain. The war changed Lee Kuan Yew's understanding of power and independence. He knew Singapore could not depend on others forever. It had to stand on its own. So, after the war, he returned to his studies, and later made a life-changing decision. He would go to England, study law, understand government, and prepare himself to build a nation from the ground up. In 1946, Lee Kuan Yew traveled to England to continue his studies. He first enrolled at the London School of Economics, but post-war London was crowded and tense. He soon transferred to Fitzwilliam College at Cambridge University, where he studied law. At Cambridge, Lee studied with discipline, focus, and determination. He read widely, law, history, and governance, studying how nations rise and how they fall. In 1949, he graduated with first-class honors in law. During this time, Lee studied alongside Kwa Geok Chu, who was equally dedicated and thoughtful. She was brilliant, steady, and intellectually clear-minded. She also earned first-class honors in law and would later become his wife and trusted partner in life. While living in England, Lee observed something important. The British ruled themselves with order, discipline, and a strong sense of fairness. But they ruled their colonies with distance, hierarchy, and inequality. This realization became a turning point. If Singapore wanted dignity and security, it would have to govern itself. In 1950, after officially qualifying as a lawyer in London, Lee Kuan Yew returned to Singapore. He began work as a lawyer and quickly became known for his clarity of thought, steady confidence, and disciplined approach to work. He did not choose law for wealth or status. He chose it because it allowed him to serve ordinary people, bus workers, clerks, and laborers, people who often had no voice under colonial rule. He spoke English, Malay, and Chinese, allowing him to communicate across all major communities. This ability to connect with people from different backgrounds would later make him a powerful national leader. In the early 1950s, Singapore was struggling with low wages, unsafe working conditions, overcrowded housing, and deep racial inequality. Representing labor unions and workers in legal disputes, Lee saw these hardships directly. He learned that a future Singapore would need clean leadership, social stability, and disciplined government to survive. He also understood that British colonial rule could not give Singapore the future it deserved. If the people wanted dignity and progress, they would need to govern themselves. In 1954, Lee and a group of young, determined colleagues, professionals, students, and union leaders, founded the People's Action Party, PAP. The party stood for self-government, clean administration, and unity among all communities. Lee became its leading voice. He spoke calmly, logically, and with deep conviction, not to impress, but to explain, persuade, and build trust. In 1955, Singapore held elections for the Legislative Assembly. Lee won a seat and entered public office for the first time. Inside the assembly, he argued for honest governance, fair wages, and equal treatment under the law. Outside the assembly, Singapore itself was tense. There were protests, labor strikes, and competing political groups struggling for influence. Lee insisted that change must come through discipline and lawful means, not through chaos or violence. Negotiations with the British government began soon after. Lee prepared carefully, studying documents, laws, and diplomatic strategy, determined to prove that Singapore was ready for responsibility. In 1959, Singapore achieved full internal self-government. The People's Action Party won the national elections, and on June 5, 1959, at just 35 years old, Kuan was sworn in as Singapore's first prime minister. He did not celebrate. He knew the challenges ahead were immense, but he also believed, with absolute clarity, that discipline, unity, and hard work could build a new nation. The speeches were over. The real work had only begun. When Kuan became Singapore's first prime minister in 1959, he faced a nation filled with uncertainty. Singapore was a small island with no natural resources, limited land, and a rapidly growing population. Unemployment was high, housing was overcrowded, and the threat of racial division remained close beneath the surface. But Lee believed that a country did not need wealth to begin. It needed discipline, stability, and a clear sense of purpose. One of his first priorities was to ensure clean and honest government. He strengthened the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, giving it the authority to investigate anyone, regardless of position, and ensuring that corruption would not be tolerated at any level of government. Ministers, officers, and administrators were held to strict standards. Public service was not to be a path to personal gain, but a responsibility to the people. Integrity became the foundation of governance. Housing was the next urgent problem. Many families lived in crowded wooden huts or cramped rooms without proper sanitation. In 1960, the government formed the Housing and Development Board, HDB, and construction began at remarkable speed. New apartment blocks rose across the island, clean, safe, and affordable. For the first time, families had homes with running water, electricity, and privacy. Lee understood that housing was not simply shelter. It was dignity, stability, and the beginning of a shared national identity. But homes were not enough. Singapore needed jobs. To build the economy, Lee and his colleagues established the Economic Development Board, EDB. They reached out to companies in the United States, Europe, and Japan, inviting them to invest and build factories in Singapore. He focused on efficient administration, social stability, and firm enforcement against corruption. Industries began to grow, and thousands found work. The economy, once fragile, began to move. Education also became a central strategy. Singapore was a multicultural society with different languages and traditions. Lee introduced English as the working language, not to replace culture, but to create a common space where every community could participate equally in the economy. At the same time, mother tongue languages, Chinese, Malay, Tamil, were protected and taught in schools. This balance allowed unity without erasing identity. Yet, despite progress, Singapore remained vulnerable, small, without natural resources, and without strategic depth. Lee believed that merging with the Federation of Malaya would secure economic and political stability. After negotiations, referendums, and public debate, Singapore joined Malaysia in 1963. Lee spoke of the merger with caution but hope, not as a victory, but as a partnership meant to strengthen both sides. With this merger, British colonial rule formally ended. Singapore was no longer under British authority, but it was now part of a larger federation, not yet fully independent as its own separate nation. However, the Union soon faced difficulties. Differences in political ideas, economic competition, and approaches to racial policy created tension between Singapore and the federal government in Kuala Lumpur. The hopes of unity would soon lead to the most difficult decision in Singapore's history. The nation was young, the challenges were great, and the decision ahead would define its future. The merger with Malaysia in 1963 had begun with hope. Lee Kuan Yew believed that being part of a larger nation would bring stability, security, and stronger economic opportunities for Singapore. But once the merger took place, deep differences surfaced. Singapore's government believed in equal treatment for all communities, while the federal leadership in Kuala Lumpur favored policies that privileged certain groups. Economic competition added to the strain. What began as cooperation slowly turned into conflict. In 1964, racial riots broke out in Singapore. Communities that had lived side by side were shaken by fear and uncertainty. The violence left emotional scars across the island. Lee Kuan Yew worked urgently to restore calm, but the trust between Singapore and the Malaysian federal government had weakened. By 1965, the situation had reached a breaking point. Continuing the merger risked further unrest. After weeks of private discussions, a painful decision was made. Singapore would separate from Malaysia. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became an independent and sovereign nation. That day, Lee Kuan Yew addressed the nation. His voice trembled as he spoke. "For me, it is a moment of anguish." He paused often, struggling to hold back tears. He had believed that unity within Malaysia could secure Singapore's future. Now, Singapore stood alone. There were no celebrations, no cheering crowds, only quiet shock and the weight of responsibility. Singapore had no natural resources, no army, no assured water supply, and no guarantee of survival. Many believed the island could not last. Some predicted it would have to return to Malaysia. Others thought it would fall under foreign influence. But Lee did not accept these predictions. If Singapore was alone, then it would learn to stand on its own. The first urgent task was security. Independence meant nothing if the nation could not defend itself. In 1967, Lee introduced national service, requiring young men to train and serve in defense. The policy was firm. A country must be able to protect its own people. Security would not depend on hope. It would depend on discipline. Water was another critical challenge. Singapore depended heavily on external sources. Lee treated water as a matter of national survival and invested in reservoirs, treatment systems, and long-term planning. It was not about the present alone, but about the future, about ensuring Singapore would never be held vulnerable through necessity. Housing continued to shape the nation's identity. The Housing and Development Board expanded its work, building new towns designed for real communities, with schools, clinics, markets, and transport. But one decision made Singapore different from the world. Families of different races lived together, not separately. Unity would grow not through speeches, but through everyday life, shared neighborhoods, shared experiences, shared futures. The economy needed to grow. Singapore did not have natural resources, so it would rely on human skill, organization, and work ethic. The Economic Development Board invited companies from the United States, Europe, and Japan to build factories and industries. Singapore promised clean government, efficient administration, and a disciplined workforce. Industries opened. People found jobs. A stable income replaced uncertainty. Education guided the direction of society. English became the working language, not to erase culture, but to ensure fairness and opportunity. At the same time, mother tongues, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil, were preserved, protecting identity and heritage. Unity was built without forcing sameness, and identity was protected without creating division. By the early 1970s, Singapore was no longer a nation uncertain of its survival. It had stability, jobs, housing, security, and a growing sense of confidence. The island that many believed would fail had shown that a nation can rise through discipline, planning, and unity of purpose. The foundation was now laid. The years of survival were ending. The years of progress were about to begin. By the early 1970s, Singapore had secured its foundations: safety, employment, housing, and a shared national identity. But Lee Kuan Yew understood that survival was not the same as success. A nation that simply survived would eventually be replaced by those that advanced. Singapore needed to rise not slowly, but decisively, or it would always remain vulnerable. The goal was no longer just to stand, it was to stand among the strongest. The first challenge was economic transformation. The world was changing. Simple factory labor would not be enough to sustain the future. Singapore needed skilled workers, scientists, engineers, and professionals. Education was reshaped to focus on discipline, mathematics, science, and technical skills. Trade schools, universities, and research institutions grew. The message was clear. Every generation must become more capable than the one before it. At the same time, Singapore continued to welcome companies from around the world. The Economic Development Board built strong relationships across the United States, Europe, and Japan, ensuring Singapore was seen as a place of stability, efficiency, and trust. Factories expanded into high-technology industries: electronics, engineering, biomedical research, and advanced manufacturing. Singapore was no longer only a factory for the world, it was becoming a workshop for innovation. The Port of Singapore played a crucial role. Strategically located along major global trade routes, Singapore became one of the busiest ports in the world. Ships arrived from every direction, carrying goods, people, and ideas. But it was not location alone that made the port successful. It was organization, discipline, and reliability. Ships that spent days waiting in other ports were processed in hours in Singapore. Efficiency became an identity, a symbol of how Singapore worked. Cleanliness and order were not minor cultural rules. They were national strategies. Clean streets, protected water sources, strict urban planning, and public discipline created a sense of environment that felt safe, predictable, and respected. Lee believed that a clean environment shapes clean behavior, that people live up to the standards of the world they see around them. Diplomatically, Singapore maintained a steady and independent voice. It built relationships without relying on any single major power. The nation learned to speak with clarity, neutrality, and respect, always firm, always thoughtful. In a world where small nations are often pulled by larger ones, Singapore remained calm, balanced, and strategic. Through these years, Lee continued to emphasize meritocracy, the idea that progress should be based on ability and effort, not background or privilege. This approach shaped education, employment, government, and leadership. People were encouraged to work hard, think clearly, and contribute honestly. The nation would move forward only as fast as its people grew.